Good afternoon and greetings from the beautiful campus of Rice University here in Houston. My name is Igor Marjanovic, and on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of Rice Architecture, it is my great honor to welcome you to our annual lecture series, Building Identities. Since this is our first event of the season, it is important to pause and reflect on the land that we all occupy and to acknowledge the settler's perspective that has often colonized, disturbed, and erased the unique relationship that indigenous peoples have with their territories. Texas was and is still home to many indigenous peoples, including Apache, Wichita, Alabama, and Kickapoo traditional tribes, as well as many others. And today we want to honor and respect all the diverse indigenous native peoples and to acknowledge the importance of their enduring connection to the territory on which we all gather today, even if only remotely. The occupation, construction, and habitation of land is both a physical but also a social process and a theme of our lecture series this year, Building Identities. Construction of physical structures is inseparable from the construction of human identities. Rice Architecture aims to broaden our understanding of building construction and identity formation as two interrelated processes, seeking to close the gap between the social and formal in the field of architecture and our world more broadly. Reflecting the pluralism of Houston as the most diverse city in the United States, Building Identities advances the agency of architecture in a new multicultural world. We are so fortunate to have Eric Howeler today to help us open up this dialogue, which we think is urgent for our school, for our city, and for the world at large. I am grateful for his participation, and I also want to extend my deep gratitude to the entire Rice Architecture Lectures Committee, faculty members Juan Jose Castellon and Liz Galvez, and our staff colleagues, Shona Forney, Noel Heinz, Maria Nicanor, and Christine Verley. Without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to my colleague Liz Galvez, visiting critic here at Rice Architecture, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Liz. Please take it away.
Thank you, Igor. So before I introduce Eric today, I would just like to do a very brief introduction. We've asked two of our students here at the Rice School of Architecture, Michelle and Vaughn, to join us in this conversation. And I will now go ahead and introduce Eric. So Eric Howeler is an educator and practitioner. He is Associate Professor in Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he teaches lecture courses and design studios with a focus on building technologies integration and leads the Energy and Environment program. Together with Mi-Jin Yoon, Eric is co-founding principal of Höweler Yoon Architecture, a research-driven multidisciplinary design studio working between architecture, art, and media. The firm's most celebrated and ongoing projects, such as the MIT Collier Memorial, a milled granite compression structure that commemorates the life of Officer Sean Collier, who was killed in action after the Boston Marathon bombing, Sky Courts, a courtyard exhibition hall in Chengdu, China, the UVA Memorial, a landscape installation dedicated to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia, the Stewart Street multifamily residential tower in Boston, the new MIT Museum in Cambridge, and Float Lab, a public art installation and floating lab on the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. So these projects cement HYA's reputation for work that is technologically and formally innovative, yet deeply informed by human experience and sensitivity to tectonics. Their works expand the scope of design beyond disciplinary boundaries towards an expanded practice. HYA's forthcoming book project, VIF, or Verify in Field, of which a small teaser published in Log 51 recounts the anecdote of a fabrication model that takes into account not only the stubborn materiality of a granite stone, but also that of the diamond tip saw which grinds it into shape, its wear, and the need for persistent recalibration. This careful design attention, from the cutting of a single stone to rendering the labor of 4,000 individual enslaved lives visible in our societal memory, extends material practice across scales and towards cultural undertakings. With this, Eric, I offer you a warm welcome on behalf of the Rice School of Architecture.
Thanks, Igor. Thanks to Rice for having me in Houston. I wish I was there with those beautiful trees, but maybe next semester or some other time. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I titled the lecture, What's the Matter? Which seems like a very casual thing you might say to someone when you greet them. Are they feeling okay? It's a way to just check in on somebody in a very sort of casual way. But I think we can read it in different ways. We could also ask, like, what's the matter in terms of what's going on? And I think as architects, it's important to always sort of be aware and sort of take stock of what the situation is. I do think the building identities theme from this semester's lecture series is kind of exciting to think about. Building identities as a kind of response to the question of, like, what's the matter? It's what's the matter, but also what matters. So just taking stock of our present moment, you know, we're still kind of in the midst of a pandemic, which has sort of reordered our sort of interactions between friends and strangers. The kind of awkward distance that we see in this image, I think, is so persistent. And I do think as the pandemic tapers down, I think we're going to have to relearn how to sort of interact with each other. At the same time, before the pandemic, we were already sort of distanced from each other through our technologies, through our devices. And it did seem like we were sort of interacting with each other through different kinds of interfaces. So we've often asked ourselves, how do these interfaces sort of alter our relations between people, between friends, between families? I think it's been said that we're in the midst of the kind of information age where everybody's connected to everybody else. At the same time, the information age coincides with the age of post-truth. We don't know how much of this information is real. We don't know how much is actually accessible. We don't know what's been redacted. And so this sort of paradox of, like, information superabundance and skepticism or even cynicism towards science and even the idea of truth. And so if we ask what's the matter, we might ask, well, there's plenty that's the matter. The democracy is at stake. We seem more divided than ever before. How do we sort of reclaim a sense of unified purpose, even if we can't all agree on everything? While climate change has altered not just weather patterns and extreme storms, but produced sort of conditions that are kind of unprecedented in their intensity and frequency. At the same time, questions of human rights and access to healthcare, reproductive rights, all these things are sort of jarring our sort of collective experiences. So I like this quote from the Charles and Ray Eames. You know, when someone says, what are the limits of design? Charles Eames says, what are the limits of problems? So for him, design is a way to address problems in the most expansive sense. And that's kind of an inspiring way to think about design. It's not about necessarily style or aesthetics, but for Charles and Ray Eames, it's about solving problems that need to be addressed. And it positions designers as uniquely equipped to do this. And that was very much the ethos of our first book, Expanded Practice, in 2009, where we sought to sort of expand the definition or the limits of what architectural practice could do. And we trespassed into other territories. We looked at interactive landscapes. We looked at responsive technologies. We said maybe media is a material that we should use as architects to design. Media being sound and light and immersive effects or responsive effects. More recently, we've been working with traditional materials like stone and concrete. And we've sort of shifted a little bit our thinking from media as a material to material after media. How do we think about stone after we have the tools to sort of manipulate it through fabrication and surveying and installation technologies? So our new book, Verify and Field, is coming out soon. And we've been thinking about some of the conversations we had in the first book. We've extended them into the second book, and we've been able to sort of reflect on the last, say, 9 years of practice and how this shift from the immaterial to the material, but now material calibrated and precisely fabricated with new tools that might be understood as a different version of media. So to answer the question, like, what's the matter? There's plenty of things that are the matter. I wanted to sort of try to answer that through a few sort of snapshots at projects. So I would argue that matter matters, material matters, maybe more than ever before. We've been thinking about not just territories and landscapes. We're doing a project in Spokane where we're saying maybe the project is an instrument for looking. Spokane's a quite beautiful landscape. This is also actually an indigenous landscape where native peoples were fishing in this river. When the hydroelectric companies set up dams, it altered the kind of livelihood of native people. So an altered landscape as a site for this intervention. We thought maybe we could install pavilions across the falls on different sides of the falls and sort of create sight lines across, inviting people to sort of better understand the place that they were occupying. We were also interested in the kind of history of Spokane and the Pacific Northwest, the logging industry and timber production. How can we think about a material today and the absence of this kind of timber and maybe the kind of prevalence of this. Certainly when we think about carbon and the importance of carbon extraction and how different materials impact the planet in different ways. These are images borrowed from Gray-Organsky, looking at the kind of embodied energy of materials and sort of pushing towards renewable materials like wood, wood perhaps reconfigured, not the kind of 2x4 and not the kind of heavy timbers that that might be sort of like in the beams sort of above my head. We propose a pavilion that could serve as a small gathering place, but also a lookout point. And this pavilion, we call it Stepwell. It proposes a kind of split amphitheater made out of mass timber. And we often do projects where we say, what do we know nothing about? And what do we want to know more about? And so we said, we want to know more about mass timber. So let's use a project to sort of help us research that. So in thinking about wood, maybe the traditional wood shop may have used sort of wood as a kind of monolithic material. The new wood shop maybe combines engineered lumber with traditional lumber. It uses large format tools to manipulate lumber and to sort of exploit its sort of strength in its sort of configuration. So cross-laminated timber sort of famously sort of reorients wood and sort of reconfigures it into a kind of new part. Again, we've been interested in digital fabrication and how we can use the work envelope of a robot to sort of work on mass timber at a much larger scale. So much of what we hear about mass timber is replacing a steel beam with a wood beam or a steel deck with a wood deck. How can we think about mass timber as truly massive, as a kind of volumetric condition? So where faces are no longer parallel. So we've been working with some friends and fabricators at Quora Stone to sort of make our own sort of glue laminated components out of Alaskan yellow cedar billets. These are sort of manipulated with sort of handheld tools as well as digital tools to form these large blocks. And I feel like this is different from simply replacing, axial members. These are not axial members, these are kind of sculptural members. And so this proposes to sort of maximize the kind of work envelope of the robot to sort of produce these unique pieces, put them on a truck, install them in Spokane, and start to produce this mini amphitheater slash viewing device. For us, it's a way to sort of produce a condition on a site that calls attention to site, through siting, as well as exploring the capacities of digital tools to sort of produce these somewhat unprecedented, I would say, sort of sculptural versions of mass timber. So mass timber, not in a traditional sense. So this is the proposal. We have been working to sort of realize these kind of intimate moments and this kind of intimate moment. And we're learning a lot about wood. Like I said, this is kind of a design research project. wondering about, questions of expansion and contraction, questions of tolerance, things that we thought we had sort of learned about in the Collier Memorial when thinking about stone. Here we're sort of translating these into wood and sort of going through our own sort of discovery process as we understand the sort of the tolerances and sort of movements of mass timber. But I think we're producing a kind of new version of wood architecture, one that seems more in tune with questions of embodied energy. And then we can speculate about what that might mean in terms of timber having its own, in a way, vocabulary. Could it introduce a different kind of expression for timber? So here's one of the first pieces that's going in on site. It's about the size of a piano, so it's massive mass timber. And here are the first pieces that have been installed in Spokane. So stay tuned. This project will be completed in the spring of 2022. The second term related to the first is ecosystems. Certainly ecosystems matter. How do we interact with ecosystems? How do we sort of map our own relationship to ecosystems, to environment? This is something that we wanted to test out for a project in Philadelphia. Philadelphia famously is a city sort of built around river trade. It's a city between the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers. And this is proposing to install an installation in the Schuylkill River. Looking at the Schuylkill River, we see that the tributary of the Schuylkill River actually sort of extends way up into sort of coal country. So this is, unbeknownst to me, it was, I learned that Philadelphia is actually a kind of extraction hub, maybe not unlike Houston. But the extraction is a traditional traditionally it was about floating coal down the Schuylkill River. And so the Schuylkill over years became highly polluted by this sort of extraction industry to the point where the Schuylkill actually caught on fire. It was so contaminated. Over time, it was remediated and cleaned up. And one of our thoughts was, could we bring people back to the waterfront? Could we sort of reconnect them to the nature in their backyard, to a kind of urban nature? And so this proposal is to sort of reinsert the citizen, the city dweller, into a kind of urban nature, in their own backyard. So to prove this idea, we fabricated a 8-foot by 8-foot by 15-foot barge, which we filled with water, and we basically submerged it in the river, thinking if we could provide a kind of eye-level view of the river that would change people's perceptions literally, but also hopefully sort of alert them to what is actually going on in the river. What kind of animals live in the river, what kind of ecosystems there are. And we proposed this to the Philadelphia Mural Arts, which is a public art organization, and they agreed to fund the construction of Float Lab as a kind of submersible structure to be deployed in the Schuylkill River in 2022. So this is a proposal for Float Lab. It's a kind of experiential moment, but it also has a kind of outdoor classroom component, and it's connected by this dock and gangway to Bartram's Garden, which is a botanical garden. So the botanical garden is the host for Float Lab, which is a temporary public art installation / environmental learning center. The hunch being that if people are sort of changing their relationship to the waterway, that'll change their perceptions and ultimately change their behaviors. And so how do we think about ecosystems as a kind of critical awareness that could be constructed in order to have other kind of ripple effects in terms of environmental footprint? And here one vista sort of looking back across the river at some of the kind of extraction industry in the city of Philadelphia in the distance. The third topic I wanted to touch on, what matters, maybe memory matters. Certainly in the age of sort of ubiquitous computing and alerts and notifications, our ability to sort of remember, or what is the status of memory in this moment, I think is sort of worth investigating. This is an image from the Boston Marathon bombings a few years ago. And in the aftermath, Officer Sean Collier was killed on MIT's campus. Immediately, a kind of spontaneous memorial sort of sprung up and Meijin Yoon, my partner, was asked to design a permanent memorial for Sean Collier. And so working with the committee, there was certainly lots of impulse to create a kind of something that was patriotic, that had some flags, and others said, maybe it should be a boulder or something natural, because Sean used to love to hike. And then we sort of thought about the MIT slogan, or the motto, which is "Mens et manus," hand in mind. Right after he was killed, Fortis was added to that, and you may have seen T-shirts or bumper stickers that said MIT strong or Boston strong. And we said, what does strength have to do with memory, and how could remembrance be thought of through questions of strength? We thought about the kind of digital age we're inhabiting, and this idea of a memorial just being a kind of a flickering sign on a highway. But we also felt that we needed something physical, something material to sort of commemorate. And so we sort of landed on a design that sort of produced what could be interpreted as a hand, it could be interpreted as a star, a figure that's extruded. It has 5 sort of buttress walls. From this figure, we subtracted another figure, the kind of boulder that was sort of alluded to. And then the memorial is really a kind of what we call a conspicuous absence. From one figure, we've subtracted another. It is placed right where he was killed, in his patrol car. This is MIT's East Campus. This is Frank Gehry's Data Center. So it was right here. We propose this 5-fingered plan, and it does create a kind of gateway into the campus and sort of frames certain sight lines. But the memorial is this, as Liz mentioned, it's a solid stone arch. Actually, it's a vault from which we sort of hollowed out a figure. And we began with the idea that, this should be solid. It shouldn't be veneered or post-tensioned. In a way, the arch is one of the oldest of architectural technologies, yet no one had built a compression arch in a long time. And so developing a kind of a model for calculating the arch, we worked with John Oxendorf, who's a professor at MIT, who's a specialist in compression structures. And we sort of proved to ourselves that it was possible to build a contemporary compression structure out of solid blocks. Here's John Oxendorf on the left, Hauke Jungjohan from Nippers Helbig, and Sam Morelli from Suffolk Construction. And so this team sort of had to revisit a kind of archaic construction technology to figure out how to build this unique structure. Each block is unique, and in a way that became a kind of metaphor for a community. So in the aftermath of the terrorist attack, I think a lot of people felt like, why do we have an open campus? Why do we have this policy of openness? Doesn't it leave us vulnerable? And I think the answer was, we believe in a kind of open campus and an open society. We don't believe in Muslim bans and other sort of stereotyping. And so this idea of like coming together as a community, coming together as a series of blocks that are working together to transfer forces became a powerful metaphor for the project. We did procure the blocks from the quarry directly because they're much larger than is typical for kitchen counters. So these are from the Virginia Mist Quarry in Culpeper, Virginia. And some of the fabrication footage, I'll just sort of advance to some of the fun parts. These are the robots that we use at Quora Stone to sort of fabricate some of these really large blocks. The robot obviously is building off a 3D model, which is what we produced as designers. And so our model went to the fabricator. It was translated into a series of cut files and tool paths, and eventually that model was used in the fabrication process. And so Liz referred to that log article where I talked about how do you know precisely where the stone begins and ends, and how do you know precisely where the saw begins and ends? And this was a question that was posed to me when I was at Quora Stone. We have such confidence in our digital tools. We think we give the fabricator the digital model, and they'll give us a piece of stone that's cut exactly to match that model, which doesn't take into account all the kind of intelligence and thoughtfulness that goes into the process. The comment was, if the saw began as a 2-foot diameter, after it cuts the stone, that 2-foot diameter is slightly less than 2 foot in diameter. And so every time it cuts, the saw blade is diminishing. And so how can we be so sure of the precision of our model if we can't sort of keep track of the precision of our tools that are presumably cutting that model, that block of stone? So here, these guys are sort of re-verifying all these dimensions and developing a kind of post-production quality control mechanism to sort of verify or re-verify the sort of dimensional accuracy of the blocks that were being fabricated. The project did come together in less than 11 months. The blocks are fabricated in Wisconsin, installed in Boston on the scaffolding. Interestingly, the scaffolds were set up on scales provided by John Oxendorf and his research team. The scales were measuring the weight of the blocks as they were placed on the scaffolds. And then as we lowered the scaffold from the keystone towards the perimeter, they were able to monitor the shift of weight from the center stone to the edges. And even though you cannot see force, you can measure weight. And so after the lowering of the scaffold and the kind of careful monitoring of the transfer of force from the center to the buttress walls, John was able to announce that we have arching action. So this is the team underneath the vault the moment the scaffold was removed, revealing for the first time this sort of conspicuous absence within it. And there are two different finishes. There's a kind of smooth finish on the inside and a kind of rough finish on the outside. But this memorial was kind of our first sort of extended contemplation of some of these questions about memory and memorialization, about structure, and what does it mean to produce symbols that a community can sort of organize themselves around. And at nighttime, the sort of lights in the pavers reflect the kind of constellation of stars on the night where Sean Collier was killed. So there's a number of sort of embedded meanings in it. And some people see a star, some people see a hand. And I think in a way, our job as designers is not to sort of over determine what those meanings are, because people will interpret things their own way, but to sort of account for the possibility of multiple readings. And I think that's important. Another topic that we've been thinking about as something that's sort of on our minds, something that we think is significant and deserves more thought, is the city. How do we build in the historic city? We're surrounded by historic structures in downtown Boston. This is a survey of buildings around a site that we were asked to design an apartment building for. This was a study for that apartment building. It's surrounded by 2- and 3-story residential buildings, but also some larger structures. And as we sort of began speculating on what's an appropriate way to build in this context, we tried lots of versions of structures that would modulate the massing to sort of reduce the kind of perception of scale of the building. And so this was a direction we ended with what we call a coursed block, a block that has a series of course lines in it that attenuate as they rise. And so at the bottom, there might be 2 floors, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the kind of stacking of floors and the articulation of those sort of courses changes the perception of height in the building. It's a very small footprint building, 7 units per floor. We then clad it in this panelized system, this multi-story panels that produce a kind of fluting pattern. And in our idea, we were sort of optimizing it for efficiency and fabrication. We produced sort of physical sort of plaster castings of what these piers might be. And our hunch was that multi-story panels would ultimately save time in construction, because it's based on the kind of mechanics of picking material and placing it in the field, thinking about the labor and the kind of efficiencies that could be had. So this was, part of our documentation process. we learned very quickly that in fact, molds are not important. The number of molds is not as important as the weight of the piers. And so we sort of reorganized our design to sort of incorporate a kind of optimal lifting sequence from the crane. From the neighborhood, you see the kind of beautiful fabric, and the building acts as a kind of backdrop to the Bay Village neighborhood. Another lesson we learned is that we have neighbors, on Shamet Street that have stoops. They did not want to look at the back of a building. And so we convinced the owner to add 2 residential units that were also townhomes. So they had their own stoops, their own entrances. And so these neighbors would look at other neighbors. They wouldn't be looking at the back of a mechanical room, for example. So the design of the building, but also the design or the completion of the street. And as the building meets the ground, we introduced some decorative ironwork, stoops and planters that would sort of dialogue with the neighboring buildings. So that was, I think, an important lesson. This is the tower in its rendered form. We always build sort of full-scale mock-ups to sort of understand the kind of the play of light on these sort of concave surfaces, and how we could respond to a kind of historic fabric, not through language in terms of mimicking a kind of linguistic architectural response, but actually through material, and providing a material that has depth and quality that would be able to dialogue with the historic context, but not through quotation or citation. These are some of the pieces, and these are 3-story long molds that were used to cast these precast pieces. We take a lot of pleasure in looking at fabrication techniques, maybe sort of unconventional ones, and having these techniques, both fabrication but also construction techniques, how they would sort of drive the design. And so looking at optimizing panels, how those panels are suspended on the building, and then the idea that the windows were simply the gaps in between the panels. So we don't see individual windows, but really just sort of voids in between. The construction sequence, here we see, the kind of aggregation of these panels to produce a kind of field condition of concave panels. And this one taken a few weeks ago, showing the kind of the aggregate effect of these courses, and the kind of thickness and depth of the facade. Another topic that we've been thinking about a fair amount is globalization, but also localization. And so when we practice overseas, sometimes we're asked explicitly to make a gesture that would be legible to a local audience. And maybe this ties into this question of building identities. When working in China, if the client says, "I need your building to have a Chinese feeling," we sort of wondered, like, what does that mean? And so we were asked to design a building for an exhibition hall in Chengdu. They said it must be a courtyard type, it must have sloped roofs, and it must give us a Chinese feeling. So that's something that we sort of struggled with. What is Chinese feeling? What is Chinese architecture? We did not want to do anything that would feel like a kind of image-based sort of reference, a kind of citation or quotation. But we did spend some time looking at traditional courtyard houses and appreciating that the architecture is both figure in the sense of a freestanding pavilion, and field in the sense that it sort of defines in a way the frame that the architecture sort of exists in. So applying that to our site, this was our first meeting, where all of us, there are 7 architects, all of us got sort of chastised by the owner for not understanding the kind of imperative to have a Chinese feeling. He said, "I don't recognize Chinese architecture anywhere here." So he sent us back to the boards and said, "Look at Chinese architecture more carefully. The Chinese feeling isn't in the shapes, it's actually in the ambiance." And then this was one moment where someone said to me, that sort of foggy stuff, that sort of thing that you can't quite draw, that's Chinese feeling. So how do you make architecture out of that? The good news is we sort of revised our designs and we sort of resubmitted and we got approved. We submitted our drawings to the client, and then we waited for 9 months and didn't hear anything. And then after 9 months, we got an email saying, "Good news, your project's moving forward. We've changed a few of the details, but it's under construction. So why don't you update your plans? The other piece of news that they neglected to tell us is that they changed the site and that they mirrored our site plan. So our building, which had been like this, was now like that. And an exhibition hall had been turned into a restaurant. So a classic Chinese developer story. But as the details were being developed, they asked us for specific materials. We chose a Chinese gray brick and these Corten window surrounds. We wanted the windows to be somehow appear larger than they were, and we thought the sort of rich color would offset the kind of grayness of the traditional brick. The other detail that I think is quite beautiful is that the gray brick, which is so pervasive in this part of China, we wanted to use it in a different way. And so we sort of imagined that there was a compass sort of embedded in every brick. And so every brick is sort of oriented on the cardinal directions. And so even when the building is on an oblique, the bricks are all aligned. And so this produces a kind of feathering of the brick. And as you walk around this building, you can use the building almost as a kind of orientation device. So the kind of feathering is in a way indexing how far off the cardinal orientations the building is. So that's a pretty subtle technique. But the result is a kind of beautiful sort of materialization of craft. Certainly the Chinese bricklayers could lay bricks like this. When we explained that we wanted them laid like that, it was also quite clear and easy to communicate. And so when working globally, how do you take into account sort of local skill, local labor, but also questions of translation from one context to the other. And it produces incredible corners, incredible textures. And at the end of the day, the client said, oh, this feels Chinese, I feel it. And so we were able to produce something that was both legible to him as a kind of Chinese architecture, but also contemporary for us as a kind of a contemporary articulation of architecture in the present. This is something we've continued to think about, this cultural identity question. These are two pavilions from the Shanghai Expo in 2010, the Chinese Pavilion and the Heatherwick sort of porcupine building. That site of the expo is being redeveloped as a park, and we've been designing two bridges that enter the park. Our idea for this competition was, how do we look at the Chinese bridge or the Chinese landscape as not a series of objects, but a series of relationships, maybe vistas, and how might we sort of take this two bridge requirement and turn it, as opposed to two bridges, maybe one sort of aperture sort of framing the water. So we designed a bridge that was sort of wider than it is long. And this quick video shows the idea of these two bridges with these semicircular cutouts. So we took the kind of moon gate idea, from a kind of elevational moment into a planimetric one, where the cutouts frame the water, but ultimately also sort of frame the sky. So this project, there's the reference to the moon gate and renderings. And then the kind of question of texture, making the sort of labor and the articulation of parts legible. So we proposed a kind of textured inside geometry and a smooth outside geometry. These are the drawings from the LDI, the Local Design Institute. And in fact, they've been under construction now for almost a year. And so we're seeing what we sort of had drawn as a kind of competition sketch and some renderings translated into reality. And it's still kind of thrilling to see ideas sort of materialized on site as real kind of experiential moments. So here, one of those sort of jutting out moments in the bridge. The last project I want to show, I'll try to show it quickly, thinks about institutions and how institutions matter. University of Virginia, obviously designed by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had sort of designed a kind of utopian moment for students and scholars to interact. what we don't know or didn't know was that Jefferson's utopia was also built on enslavement. And so as this history has sort of come to light and become acknowledged, the university was looking for a means to acknowledge that. And students actually raised this question with the university, and they forced the university to produce a permanent memorial to the enslaved laborers. And so we studied Jefferson's academical village. We sort of acknowledged the histories, but these are kind of imperfectly acknowledged. This was a memorial that had been laid in 2007, but its inadequacy in a way sparked the permanent memorial that we were able to complete through an elaborate design process. And I should say, we, when I say we, I mean, you know, Mejan and myself and our team, which includes Mabel Wilson, Frank Dukes, Greg Bleem, and Eto Otitigbe. We did a 6-month engagement process with the community. And then we did our design process, and then we sort of cycled back through with the community. And we listened to what they were interested in. They were interested in the unvarnished truth, you know, some real truth telling. They also wanted, you know, real imagery. They didn't want it to be too abstract. And so working with the community, working with the university, we arrived at a scheme that we called the Freedom Ring, this idea of a figure that might evoke a kind of just a series of bodies arrayed in space. This is the ring shout, which is a kind of dance. But the memorial in its most basic is simply a ring of people and a kind of clearing, you know, the ability to gather. And so that was, in a way, the point of departure for the project. It is a ring, it's a landform, it's inscribed in the ground. It has an inside horizon line that comes up and comes back down. And it's really close to Jefferson's rotunda. And we noted that the rotunda is a partial sphere, and this is a partial cone, but they share the same diameter, which was kind of accidental. But maybe 80 feet is the dimension of a kind of a gathering, whether it's an interior gathering or it's an exterior gathering place. But this was conceptualized as a kind of a landform with a kind of inside face and an outside face. We tested this out sort of ergonomically, you know, and how does this rise up over your head? We tested it materially, you know, with mock-ups in stone. Working with artist Eto Otitigbe, he was inspired by the stonework of local tombstones from the time and the kind of roughness there. We couldn't help but imagine the kind of roughness here and the kind of the traces of scar tissue here. And Isabella Gibbons became a kind of important figure as a freed slave, as someone who wrote about her experience and was actually photographed in this rare photograph. Eto had been working in a mode of translating self-portraits into material, and Eto proposed to take Isabella's eyes and inscribe them in the stone. So her photographic portrait was inscribed in the stone through a series of cuts of varying depth. And so this technique turned into these mock-ups, which turned into this texture on the exterior wall. So a fair amount of like technical research, but also kind of social engagement to sort of find out what people wanted, and they desperately wanted something legible, something that they could imagine themselves in the place. So Isabella's eyes are here, and they said some of the descendants said, you know, she's watching, you know, she's a witness of pasts, but also a kind of watcher in the present. Some construction photos and the model that it came from. So these translations from like the digital to the real, you know, and the kind of refinement of details was kind of amazing to sort of work between modes. One last story about the names. The names, obviously, we're trying to remember 4,000 people, but sometimes we don't have their names. They're just called hands, extra hands. And so the unknown aspect led us to sort of create these marks without names. And sometimes, you know, questions of craft or trade. And then accidentally, when it rains, the water sort of gathers and spills out, and this just looks like tears coming down this memorial. Right after it was completed, we all sort of were horrified by the killing of George Floyd. And the memorial became a point where people would come to be together, to take a knee, to kind of reaffirm a set of shared values. And so the memorial became active in the present, not just in looking at the past. And so maybe I'll just stop here, and just reflecting on the question of what can design do, and asking ourselves what matters. There's so much work to be done, and to some extent it's about sort of prioritizing, what matters, and how we can work as designers to sort of focus on the things that really matter. So with that, maybe I'll stop and invite a bit of a conversation.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for that wonderful talk, very thoughtful remarks, and beautiful, inspiring work that cuts across modes of drawing, making, prototyping, and building both artifacts and different stories out there in the world. It's interesting to look back at the kind of the range of works that you showed, and to, at least for me, two things come together as a sort of a confluence in the work. One is, maybe we could call it a narrative. The other one could be quest for materiality, and how do you overlap narrative over materiality in a work of an architect. And when I think about a narrative, I think both about the kind of the joys of the narratives and the kind of the tragedy of the narrative, like the joys of people's stories, the histories, the memory, but also the tragedy of human history, the tragedy of people's stories, and how you not only overlap narrative and materiality, but both kind of the dream world of the world, but also kind of the tragedy that happens historically, it seems, on a continuous basis. And it's kind of similar with materiality. I think it's both the kind of the joys of working with materials, with prototyping, with architecture as a kind of a material practice that results in artifacts as kind of evidence and traces of civilization, but materiality as the kind of tragedy of material extraction, for example, and the kind of cycle of material that it produces, and how architecture balances between those two poles of how we engage materiality in the same way how we engage the narrative. So thank you for that kind of a complex and very nuanced view and delicate kind of a transition from one point to another, which I'm sure has generated quite a few ideas and questions from our audience. So we will slowly transition to hearing some of the questions and engaging the audience and the panelists in the conversation. Liz?
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture, Eric. I was really struck both with the naming of the lecture, What's the Matter? And then, the more that you continue to unpack that term through each of the projects, I couldn't help but think of, or be reminded of, Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, where she really uses this word matter, right? There's actually a beautiful quote. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. And so, like, I was fascinated, for example, by this question of, well, as architects, how do we, as people who are kind of trained to deploy matter in the world, how do we use that training to respond to some of these other matters which matter? And I was struck, for example, when you talk about the possibility for design research around mass timber, right? Like the idea that you can use a project rather to investigate a material and to investigate, for example, carbon sequestration. So maybe I don't have like a very precise kind of question formulated, but I just wanted to get us into this zone of matter and matters, and this kind of connection between materiality, which I think Igor has started to also bring into the conversation, and as architects, how we engage these bigger kind of cultural questions.
No, thanks for both of those readings. I teach thesis prep at the GSD, and I ask my students, what are you interested in? What are your terms? And we have 70 students, and so I looked at 70 terms, and the term that came up the most was materiality, and I was like, wow, that's so interesting, because I thought it would be something else. I thought it would be identity or politics or climate, all these things. But materiality or matter sort of rose to the top. And I wondered, is that because we've been on Zoom and everything feels so unreal? Or when we turn on the TV, things are so crazy that we're just like, it couldn't possibly be true. And so there's a kind of irreality of things, and sort of material sort of confirms a kind of shared reality. We can both sort of touch the same piece of stone. So maybe it was more of a kind of yearning for materiality that the students are responding to in the present. But I do think, the return of materials, I think is really interesting. And I like Igor's framing of it as the tragedy of materials, things that we, as architects, we might be trained to think about, beautiful materials, but now we can't think about concrete without a certain amount of guilt. We can't think about steel without imagining the kind of embodied energy. So I think that's not a bad thing. I think it just means we have to be more deliberate. It's like, COVID has sort of set us apart and shown us that we have to work remotely, but when we come together, we really make it work. We really make it meaningful. So I think these terms, matter and what matters, I think they're just useful for us to sort of recalibrate our values, and ultimately, articulating those values and being deliberate about those values. I think that's one of the things we can do.
Yeah, I found it really interesting how you bring in your students and the conversations that are happening in the studio. And since we're really fortunate to actually have two of our own students here, I wanted to maybe bring Michelle into the conversation. We talked earlier, and I think you had some really interesting curiosities about Eric's kind of practice as an instructor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for kicking off the series. I was curious, since design in its nature is a collaboration, if there's anything that you've learned from your students that you'd perhaps like to take into your practice, or anything that they've kind of hinted you towards as far as architecture's future that might have shifted you in a different direction?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I do think we are in a privileged position of being both in the practice and in the academy. So we have the kind of engagement with the world, and we have the engagement with the world of ideas. And those two are constantly sort of bombarding us with a set of values. I think it's easy to practice sort of disengaged and to fall into certain habits. And so I think working with students, I like to say they keep me young, because they're constantly challenging me and, saying, that wasn't very precise. Can you say that? So I do appreciate that, that young people in some of our institutions have such aspirations, but also anxieties. And as thesis director, I can map their anxieties through what they choose to do in thesis. Their thesis projects, are a kind of cross section of a kind of generational set of aspirations and anxieties. We also employ some of our former students, and they sort of bring some of those ideas into our studio. So I feel like we're lucky to be engaged in the academy and the kind of research that entails. Like the idea of mass timber is like, how do you gain expertise in this? Do you need a client to do it? Maybe you find a way to sort of build expertise, so we can sort of direct our projects towards learning about certain things. At the same time, our students are asking, like, they want to know more about mass timber. They want to know how to impact the environment less. So it pushes us, to learn just as they're learning, So just because we're teachers doesn't mean we stop learning. In fact, that's why we are teachers, because we enjoy those moments of uncertainty and discovery. So that doesn't sound very profound, but I think it's true. We learn so much from our students, and that keeps us really I think not just alert, but sort of attentive, to what matters now.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for a really engaging response, Eric. I want to bring Vaughn into the conversation. We actually have a question from the audience, which perhaps speaks to the theme of design process. And Vaughn, I think you also had some curiosities on this topic for Eric. So maybe I'll give you the opportunity to voice some of those curiosities.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering where you gain inspiration for your ideas, and maybe like on a more concrete example, what was the starting point of the Collier Memorial? Was it like, as you mentioned, the concept of the missing figure, or the community coming together, or the material?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. Where do ideas come from? Yesterday I was in studio and someone was asking like, oh, what do I need to do? They want answers. And I'm like, you know what? Ideas don't just come from the sky. Like you have to, like rain, like hitting your head, like you have to do a rain dance to sort of provoke those ideas. So like, you can't just sit still waiting for the idea to happen. You have to do something. And so I tell my students, like, make something, and what you make will sort of start a dialogue with you, and who is it for? It's not for me. Don't draw your plans for me, draw it for yourself, because I think you really need to enter into a dialogue with your own work, for students. In our studio, we often make things that we don't know where they're going, and there might be things that are, lying around, like, what is this thing? What can we do with this? And maybe we can find a project to put it into. But I think the idea of a process, developing a process, both as students and as architects, I think that's so important. Sometimes those are material based. Sometimes it's an interest in geometry. Ideally, it does many things. And I think the memorials were kind of incredible moments where we found one thing was doing many things. It was telling stories. It was material research. And it had this incredible resonance with the present, and that sort of was astounding, when to see the kind of impact of that. And I think that's something it's hard to imagine as a student, I think, to see your ideas built and materialized. And that is like the biggest thrill in the world, to see people interacting with the world that we've changed. The University of Virginia was beautiful before we did something to it. But when we did something to it, it changed the way people interacted with it. And that is the biggest thrill in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vaughn. We have we have time for one final question. And so I'm going to select one of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. Thank you for your presentation. From an anonymous attendee. A lot of your work seems to invite the users to take a moment of pause or reflection. And I think the idea of reflection or mindfully cultivating slowness in a busy world is also something that is of the matter currently. How do you think about this idea in relation to your designs? Or is this something that comes up more tangentially?
That's a great question. I do think, we don't talk about slowness, but we certainly talk about attention and reflection. So how do you slow people down when they're just running from meeting to meeting? And we've certainly felt the kind of acceleration of everyday life. I love Milan Kundera's book, Slowness, where he talks about when I'm walking, I have an idea and my body slows down. I'm thinking, and so I slow down in order to think. I love that. Could architecture make us more attentive? I hope so. Walter Benjamin says architecture is always experienced in a state of distraction. So maybe an approach to architecture might be to cultivate a kind of attentiveness. And sometimes that could be done with, what's the translation? Is it spectacle or is it nuance? And I like nuance. I like architecture that makes you look twice, that makes you think about things. So I do think we strive for a kind of attentiveness or a kind of perceptual awareness, whether it's awareness of geometry or material, but also ecosystems. Seeing the river at eye level would sort of transform your perception of that river. being in it, as opposed to above it. So we do think about the body and attention and perception and maybe slowness. Maybe we need to think about slowness because so much of our lives have been accelerated that we're maybe all in desperate need of slowness. I really like that.
Thank you, Eric, for that reflection. In particular, I feel linking slowness and nuance is a good way to see how it can feed into the sort of creative work of architects, which is a pretty powerful thing. Thank you again for a wonderful talk and your remarks and your time today. We wish you, Mijen, and all of your team members and collaborators all the best as you develop your body of work. And indeed, we do hope to host you here in person under the live oak trees in some very near future. So thank you again, really appreciate your participation. And I also want to thank Liz, Michelle, and Van for the wonderful job in bringing the questions and conversations into the fold today. Thank you for that. And thank you for all of you who attended our event today. We look forward to seeing you again next week for the second installment of our lecture series with architect Michael Willis. In the meantime, we wish you good health and all the best from Houston, Texas. Thank you again and goodbye.